Well, it's great to see this group here today to learn more about such an important topic, ESG. And I can't think of a better person to be with us to share on this topic than Brad. Brad, just over a year ago, you started your own firm focused on ESG, Credo ESG. And before that, Brad was Chief Sustainability Officer of UNC. And he's a thought leader in the sustainability space. He's run a couple of clean tech firms, and also had a legal career on Wall Street and in investment management in Europe and London. And he was a member of the first graduating class at North Carolina School of Science and Math, and then went on to UNC where he was a Moorhead Scholar, where he also earned his JD. So we're so pleased to have Brad here with us today. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So I think a day doesn't go by before you see something about ESG. For instance, here, big ad, don't put Duke Energy in your ESG investments. Yesterday, or the last few days, I saw the Wall Street Journal, Guide to Wealth, the 3 kinds of ESG investing, and this whole handout has information. And I have a whole file, ever since I knew I was going to have the pleasure of interviewing you, I have a whole file that I feel like every day I stick something in it. These are just a couple of examples. So, Brad, if we could start by, I've heard you use the phrase building better businesses. When you talk about ESG, could you explain a little bit about what you mean when you say that?
Sure, Grace, and I think everybody probably knows what ESG stands for, but I always like to try and cover the basics when I give a talk. So ESG, the acronym is environmental, social, and governance. And really the whole idea behind it is to start using metrics other than just short-term earnings to look at companies. And that's really the basic idea of it. The pendulums always swing back and forth in management and corporate, sort of how we measure the success of companies. And we reached a point where I think with the pressures of private equity, so much being metrics driven just around finance, that companies were just being measured on quarterly earnings. And we were really away from the things that made companies great. I'm a small town North Carolina kid. I grew up in a town that had 2 companies there, DuPont and Olin. And Olin in particular was the type of company that I think ESG is in many ways looking to replicate going forward. Because Olin, despite the fact that they ran a paper plant, were horrific polluters, so they flunked E. But on social and governance, they were such a valued part of our community. And they did things for the schools, they put money in there, they had a great recreational center for their employees. If you got a job there, it was going to be a job for life. So the idea of ESG and building better companies is to think long term and to come up with a way that can be measured, that you can look at companies and say, what are they doing that's going to create long-term value? On the governance side, what are they doing to ensure that they act ethically at all times, that they uphold the highest principles, they don't bribe people, they don't bribe foreign governments, they have good safety standards. On the social measure, what are they doing for their employees? Are they providing long-term value, or are they a company that's paying minimum wage, providing no benefits, and really taking advantage of not only their workers, but the communities in which they operate? And that bleeds over into environmental as well. Are they polluting? In North Carolina, we've had these horrific problems with contamination of the Cape Fear River with PFAS compounds that came from DuPont operating basically a Teflon plant for a long time. And you look at that plant was very profitable, Teflon was a great product, but the long-term implications of that for society, for North Carolina, for drinking water, for just for air quality, these are horrible problems. So now we're starting to say, let's look at this as part of the overall way that we judge an investment. And if we get it right, we're going to end up with companies that should produce more long-term value and also should avoid risk. So it's 2 ways that the financial performance can be better by by being responsible and thinking about all these elements of ESG.
Okay, great, thank you. So there's 3 letters, the E, S, and the G. Which one takes the most volume of questioning, of work for you, or maybe if you can speak in general about the 3 in which you think is getting the most play, and then maybe for you and your situation, where you focus most? Do you focus evenly, or do you focus more on one of the 3?
Yeah, we'll be talking about this the rest of the time we have here today. But I think G is something that most companies have done a pretty good job. So I'm going to go in reverse order of complexity, what I think complexity is, and the ability to work with companies. But G is really working with your lawyers in lots of ways, and corporate ethicists, and making sure that you're doing the right things. And right and wrong in a corporate context is pretty easy to figure out a lot of times. Things like conflict of interest rules. S, when you think of S, it's a mixture of HR, your safety elements for your employees, but also community relations and what you're doing there. I think that E right now is actually sucking all of the oxygen out of the ESG discussion, and for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we've seen just an incredible uptick in people wanting to talk to us since the SEC came out with proposed regulations for reporting on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And I've just used a lot of jargon and acronyms that we can unpack a bit as to what Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are. But this is really spurring the environmental discussion. I think you've got that along with the headlines. Yesterday it was the flooding in Yellowstone. And I don't know if you've seen the videos of that. Those of you who've been to Yellowstone, it's just absolutely mind-blowing. They had to close the park because of rainfall and snow melt that is really climate driven. So we're getting more and more climate events that are driving the discussion. Whether we put a label on that of being an environmental issue that's ESG related, or like in North Carolina, last year's budget in the state had $800 million basically going towards things that are climate change related, but we found a way not to say that, and we're focused on rainfall events and flooding and coastal flooding and issues that we can find a way to talk about, but the impact on the environment is just massive. And environment also is something that if you're running a company, when you think about recruiting, you've got to be attuned to all of ESG. Your employees, the kids coming out of school now, they're very savvy about this. They want to work at a place where it's going to be inclusive and the company cares about the environment. So S and E are incredibly important in recruiting, but I do think that E is going to be the dominant factor here over the next couple of years.
And that plays well to your background, because part of me was thinking as you were commenting on my question was, is it because of your background that's where people maybe come to you and that's where you focus? Maybe a little bit of that, but it's good, the situation, because it does leverage your experience base really well.
You're a very good interviewer, so thank you for redirecting me to the question that I didn't answer. Yes, my background being environmental, I think that has been part of our calling card. But as there are a number of companies that are specialists in just doing the accounting around emissions, and we don't do that in depth. There's a lot of expertise. There's some software companies that have sprung up. We've got a company that now has achieved billion-dollar startup status called Persephone that seems to be hiring anybody in the world that's an expert on emissions right now. I was talking to one of their senior people yesterday. She joined in February. They had 175 employees and they have 350 as of today. Wow. They've developed a software program and they will help you, they don't even make money off of it, they'll help you buy offsets for your carbon footprint. And maybe really quickly, just to digress into what we're talking about on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and carbon offsets. So when you look at emissions that are related to activity, there are 3 types of emissions. There's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. It's very intimidating having Vic Rao here as quite the expert at all of this, so Vic's going to correct me when I get this wrong. But the way I think about scope 1 emissions is, scope 1 emissions is where your entity controls the emissions. So, are you burning something at your site? Like when I worked at UNC, we were burning coal and natural gas to produce steam and electricity. Scope 2 emissions are caused when you purchase energy that someone else has burned something to create. And the easiest example of that is the electricity that we're using in this room right now. So, Duke Energy is burning coal, they're burning natural gas. So the emissions related to the electricity that's used to create the light in this room, those are scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions get far more complicated. And the idea is, if you are like Ford Motor Company, you've got upstream emissions in your product chain, the seats, what would it take to produce the seats that you purchase from whatever company manufactured those? What about the tires? You got all kinds of emissions that those companies have had, either scope 1 or scope 2. Then you put that together in your product. Well, then you sell the product, and that product's going to burn gasoline or diesel for a long time. So those are scope 3 emissions as well. And the idea of looking at scope 3 emissions is to try and figure out what the company should be responsible for. Like, Exxon could claim to be carbon neutral if they found a way to offset the energy they use in their refining business. But good God, the products that they produce are the most damaging to the environment of any products that we've got in the world. So thinking through scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 is the key. What the SEC is doing is saying that emissions this is material information. I know we've got Ken Lewis, I know other lawyers in here that are securities lawyers. The SEC's job is to make sure that material information is available to investors to be able to make decisions about companies. And what they've done with climate and emissions is to say companies need to disclose this information because it is material to investors. They need to understand what are the risks to the companies. The risk to the company could be physical. They could have an operation that's in an area that could be affected by storms that are going to have greater intensity because of global warming. But it also could be the risk to that company of what's going to happen with their product as we focus more on emissions. If you're in the auto industry and you don't have a strategy around electric vehicles, probably means that your long-term stock price is going to go down. It's not going to be the same as Tesla's. So these are the types of things that the SEC is trying to bring in by requiring emissions disclosure and disclosure of climate risk. Yes, expertise like mine is becoming more important to lots of companies. And on the positive side, capital markets are recognizing that there should be a differentiation in pricing between green activities and non-green activities. So I've got a client that I'm working with right now who is getting a green credit facility that's going to be a cheaper credit facility than a comparable credit facility if they can meet the criteria on that. So the type of thing that we would actually be doing is working up what is that criteria? What can they use the money for? Why is that green? How do you ensure that it's green? Is this going to be something that the auditors look at to make sure the proceeds get used for the right thing? And thus, by doing that, they should save 5 to 10 basis points on their borrowing costs.
Great, thank you, Brad. You touched briefly on UNC and the coal plant. So I have to share a little story. My son was at UNC when Brad was the chief sustainability officer there. And then shortly after he graduated, he took on a role, he's a community organizer for League of Conservation Voters, and he is organizing around for Climate NC. And one project that he decided to take on was the UNC coal plant. And my son never really asks me for any help, and he doesn't really appreciate it when I offer my help. Some of you could relate. But he did reach out to me and said, hey Mom, you know that guy Brad Ives, don't you? Could you maybe introduce me? And I was like, wow, he's asking me for help. And I said, certainly, son. And so I made the introduction, and then one time, several weeks later, he came home and he said, Mom, that guy Brad Ives, that was the best thing you've ever done for me. I said, maybe, and I asked him, I told him, I had dinner with him this weekend, I said, hey Nick, I'm gonna be interviewing Brad for the Harvard Club. Can you explain to me what he's doing, or what he's been mentoring you on, and what he's helping? And he didn't really explain it to me much. He kind of moved on to the next topic about the music festival he's going to. But maybe could you explain to me, or maybe explain to the group a little bit, because I think it was a big project of yours.
Well, first of all, Grace has a very savvy son, Nick, and what Nick is trying to do is so UNC has been burning coal since the 1800s to produce energy for the campus, electricity and steam, and primarily steam. And this is the key to understanding UNC's problem. And for those of you who don't know the background, this actually cost me my job at UNC. You can Google the Daily Tar Heel article. It's actually one of the most accurate things I've ever read in the press, and I've read a lot of press about myself. It's usually wrong, but this one got it right. So UNC, because it's a steam, well, and actually, those of you who've got a Stanford connection, it's a great contrast of what wealthy private universities can do. Stanford had a steam-driven campus and decided to move away from that to cut their Scope 1 emissions of burning natural gas on campus to create hot water and steam. So Stanford came back and ripped out their steam infrastructure and went building by building to put in hot water infrastructure at a cost of well over $1 billion. And U.S. taxpayers in North Carolina don't want Chapel Hill to come and spend $1 billion to change out their infrastructure. It's just a huge cost. So the conundrum is the campus probably has over $1 billion sunk in the infrastructure of centralized steam. And steam gets used for process heat at the hospital, used to create hot water, used in a lot of laboratories. It's really key, and once you've made this commitment, it's hard to go away from it. So it's very hard to produce steam without burning something. If you want to use electricity to produce steam, it's thermally very inefficient, and the cost would be more than double the operational cost. Plus, you have the capital expenditure of putting in electric boilers, and you'd actually have to kind of purge this part of my mind, but I think it would increase UNC's power load by a factor of 3 or 4. So just bringing the power lines to campus would be pretty changing to a town like Chapel Hill and Carrboro. Imagine having to bring a couple hundred kilovolts of electricity into there. Not pretty. So what Nick and others have been doing, I think the great thing with Nick is he was organizing students to say, why are we still using coal? We're one of the last campuses in North Carolina to use coal. In part, that's because the other campuses just had a small boiler for operations that were easily replaced by electricity or natural gas. And they wanted to, end this activity. And I said, Nick, this is great. It needs to happen. We need to move away from coal, but you have to be pragmatic about this. And to his credit, he was willing to listen to that. Most students it's binary. We don't like coal, so let's stop using coal, shut the plant down. Well, people at the hospital won't be able to have surgery anymore because we can't sterilize the instruments. Things like that. So he has done a really great job of getting the students who are fired up trying to solve this problem to understand the practical nature of this, and that you have to figure out how to keep hospital system laboratories, things like this operating. And then within that, thinking of how do you approach the administration about change? When I worked at UNC, you always got the dreaded one-page list of demands that usually came from some national organizing group that were pretty ridiculous, that would want all fair, local, and organic food in the cafeteria. You think, oh, that sounds great, but what does that do to the cost that you're going to have per plate for kids from small towns whose parents have scraped every penny together to get them to go to school? They don't need to increase their food costs by double. And you would get this petition with a couple hundred signatures that they would pull together, and they would come hand it to you, and that would be the end of the dialogue. But what Nick is doing with the organizing is actually sitting down with leadership on campus.
Yeah, he told me that you helped him source a meeting with, I think, the provost, and he was very excited about that.
Yeah, and the provost equally was very excited that, I just had breakfast.
You liked his blonde hair?
Yeah, and Chris Clemens.
And tattoos.
Chris Clemens, the provost, is very conservative, but he spends a lot of time with students. And it was neat to see both sides thrilled about getting together to have the dialogue on what was possible. And UNC is going to have to go to 100% natural gas. That they don't have another choice, but they know this is an interim step. And then, what is the step after that? Is it going to be electrify everything, have electric boilers to produce the steam, or is it going to be going to hydrogen? Those are the only two answers I can come up with. I think it's going to be a limited set of answers, but this realization that you have to come together, you have to have dialogue, you have to engage. You can't that having your one-page manifesto that you deliver with 800 signatures doesn't solve the problem. And the way you actually solve the problem, and this to pull it back to corporate things and ESG, that this is what we're going to have to do with so many of the environmental issues, is be pragmatic, look for the compromise, understand that we can't go to zero emissions immediately, even though we need to, and figure out what is the way to spend $1 to make the biggest carbon impact the fastest. And that's the dialogue that is going on. The problem with getting UNC to 100% gas is the gas pipeline isn't big enough to bring enough gas to campus to go to 100% gas. When I was there, we spent, it took me about 2.5 years to win the confidence of the employees at the Energy Services Division that reported to me, to get them to understand that I supported them. I understood that they needed to have reliable steam and power on campus, and to get them to talk to me honestly about what the solutions were. And it turned out that we could modify the plant for slightly over $2 million to go to 100% gas, which was just this freakishly wonderful solution, because the alternative was to build an entire new plant for well over $100 million. But then we figured out that we couldn't get enough gas to campus to do that. So the solution I was working on was to actually get a long-term gas supply contract with a major oil and gas company, where they would finance part of the upgrades for the pipeline, and they would also bundle the gas sales with carbon offsets. So at least we could be doing something to be neutral in the time while we transitioned to something that truly was net zero. So Nick and his merry band of students are engaged with the administration. The administration, I think, is being realistic about the solutions, and I'm optimistic that they're going to come up with something.
Well, thank you. Brad is obviously still having his good impact on UNC. Thankfully, a little bit through my son. Thank you very much for that. So you also just mentioned in your earlier remarks something about Tesla. So I have an article here from the Wall Street Journal that says, Musk calls ESG index outrageous scam. He says, it's an outrageous scam. He tweeted this. Weaponized by phony social justice warriors. It determines how compliant your business is with the leftist agenda. And he said this when Tesla was dropped from an equity index that tracks ESG, and Tesla was the largest company to be dropped. And the S&P responded, while Tesla may be playing its part in taking fuel-powered cars off the road, it has fallen behind its peers when examined through a wider ESG lens. They explained that Tesla lagged behind its peers for a variety of reasons, including its carbon strategy, working conditions, and handling of regulatory investigation. So this made me think about, to ask you, what are the most important metrics in measuring ESG, and how is this evolving, and what are the biggest challenges that your clients perhaps are facing in ESG reporting, and then just who is the governing body for ESG?
Oh, wow. I think we got about 10 different questions in there.
So Elon, we can thank Elon for starting this conversation.
Yeah, let me start with Elon. I'm pretty smug on this one because our newsletter in February, I don't know, John, I don't know if you or Vic or anybody can, if you guys get my newsletter, but the title of the February newsletter was Elon, 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 it's Black History Month. And that was the title because at that time, we decided to call Tesla out because they had lost a racial discrimination lawsuit over one elevator operator in their Fremont plant who had been harassed horrifically. The company had been put on notice, they hadn't done anything, and the judgment was $137 million for that. Got reduced on appeal to $15 million since our newsletter came out. But the state of California also was investigating between 200 and 300 claims of racial and sexual discrimination that were happening in Tesla's factories in California. And we brought that up to say that even if you are having, if you are one of the best e-companies in the world, that doesn't give you a free pass to discriminate against people, to have horrific working conditions for women and people of color and LGBTQ people. And it's been interesting since then to see the tide turning against somebody like Elon, because he actually, when you start backing up and looking at it, he flunked governance. You'll remember that Tesla bought Solar City, his brother's company, in a transaction that made absolutely no financial sense. Solar City was just about to go bankrupt and probably could have bought the assets of it 6 to 12 months later for single pennies on the dollar. So bad governance, the board with not enough independent members on it, social, just horrific, and they're still that way. When you look at the environmental performance, other than the fact that they're producing electric cars, they're not paying attention to what's happening in their supply chain. The upstream part of their supply chain is terrible. So I'm still queasy with kicking a company like Tesla out of the S&P 500 ESG index when you're leaving some other companies in there that have really bad environmental track records. But those other companies have much better track records on S&G, and I think this is part of the failure of the market to look holistically at ES and G. I think I've answered maybe 2 of your 10 questions, but it's a really great case study that you should not get a free pass. I think that a lot of the public, so you're asking, who regulates this? And that question's getting answered in interesting ways right now. That mainly for public companies, you had companies like Sustainalytics and MSCI are 2 leading companies that provide ratings services for ESG performance. And Bloomberg attacked MSCI last fall, calling them out on the fact that like McDonald's is, I believe, a AAA or AA rated ESG performer in the MSCI index. And the MSCI index really looks at how companies comply with public regulation and doesn't look at just kind of overall abstract measures of ESG performance. very recently, we've had two things happen that signal that the true regulators, BaFin in Germany and the US Securities and Exchange Commission, are starting to take policing of this seriously and realize that just throwing an ESG label on something is not good for investors. So BaFin rated DWS, which is Deutsche Bank's asset management division, because they had claimed that half of the assets they were running were green assets. And the BaFin just realized that was an absolute bogus claim. So they went in and raided the offices, seized records, and the CEO of DWS resigned within a week of that. Here in the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission has just announced a probe of Goldman Sachs over their ESG mutual fund product. Again, claiming that they are mislabeling it and not really delivering. In this case, what they're saying is the marketing materials that Goldman put out do not match the investments that are in the fund. So that's securities fraud. So we're starting to see the real regulators wake up and realize that these are material issues for investors and they actually have to go and enforce. But I think that you're going to see there are going to be some interesting developments of, much like with the credit markets, where we outsource management to private for-profit entities like Standard & Poor's and Moody's. We are having companies come along that are going to rate the quality of carbon offsets, that are going to evaluate ESG measures. And it'll take a little bit of time for these to shake out, the different expertise to get combined in a way that will be truly useful for investors. But we do have this model of the public securities rating agencies to mirror and look at going forward.
Thank you, Brad. I want to see if people in the audience might have a question that they'd like to ask Brad.
I do. Brad, your knowledge is so in-depth and as well as broad. It's impressive. I do want to just pick up on your Tesla remarks. You know, Tesla's at the forefront, but now you have the rest of the world hastily trying to go into this electric car space. And on the surface, it sounds wonderful. Get all the gas guzzling cars off the road. But there's a drumbeat that's getting louder, I think, about, no, wait a minute. You gotta look at the sort of the upstream, we've got this huge supply chain that's coming together to service this enormous pivot in the automobile market. But downstream, what's happening with the recycling of the car batteries themselves, which I understand is a hazardous challenge that most people haven't figured out yet?
I'm looking at Vic to bail me out on the current state of things. But I mean, the quick take is the same drumbeat is coming for wind farms and solar, and I have to say, at one level, it pisses me off because we're not at the point of having a big recycling need, and when we get there, because there are a lot of valuable materials in these things,
exactly,
the industry is going to come up. I mean, I read a great article. In fact, I think it's a company that's got operations here in Raleigh on solar panel recycling. But we still don't know how long these things are going to last. Vic knows a hell of a lot more than I do about batteries. So I'll
you want me to give a short answer?
Yeah.
The short answer is that it's mostly about the lithium-ion batteries.
Yes.
And if something's not done about it, there are two problems. One is that lithium is pretty much sourced from South America, and so those countries will become basically the OPEC of lithium. And we are, I was using slang word, not going to do with it. The other is that the other valuable elements like cobalt are coming from other dodgy countries, okay, which we won't name, okay? And so if you don't recycle, we have an issue that goes beyond just an environmental issue.
Absolutely,
okay?
absolutely.
Recycling technically is very feasible. It's the economics, okay? So we've got to get used to, we'll have to maybe pay a bit more. But we absolutely have to go there. And so I'll tell you, technically it is not it is also straightforward, not easy, but straightforward.
Okay.
Thank you. I think we had a question in the back.
Hi, Mr. Ives. My name is Matt Sellers. I appreciate you bringing up Germany and talking a little bit about the S and the G components with regard to Tesla. And I'm not sure if you know, but I was wondering what other countries are doing. I guess Europe is probably more similar to the United States with regard to the E, but with regard to the S and the G, do we see that in other more developing countries and regions of the world, or is that not kind of caught on as they're continuing to develop economically first?
That's a great question, and the answer is sort of complicated and regional. Talking about governance, this is one thing where the U.S. has had the lead over the rest of the world for a very long time. We've got something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and for a long time, we were the only nation on earth that had anything like this. And this prohibits U.S. companies from bribing people, and either government officials or people at companies and foreign countries. The EU, I believe it was about 15 years ago, finally instituted something, and has been playing catch up. But if you're doing business in China in particular, their governance standards are there. So this is something that well, another related thing is taxation. This global agreement about a minimum corporate tax is, I think, a huge step forward on global governance that's going to make better companies long term. On the S, in some ways on S, Europe has been ahead of the US, in other ways it's been behind. Despite the fact that we have a lot of problems in this country and a long way to go, this is an area where legally we do a better job than lots of other countries. Our judicial system, which you can do a whole nother breakfast on, has been the model for the world. And, we've got some serious challenges that we're undergoing right now, but we give people redress for problems they have at work. So that's an area that we've been doing well. I would argue that in the investment world and paying attention to E, that Europe's been ahead of the US really for the last 20 years. And I saw that a lot. I ran European sales for what is now Barings. And in doing that, the early movement by Dutch pension plans in particular was incredibly meaningful and really advanced a lot of technologies, especially around solar and battery technologies. And that's been really good. But it's a US and Europe. Brazil, geez, environmentally, socially, governance, it's a mess, and it's going to damage their economy, and it's going to hold them back. You see that in a lot of South American and Latin American countries. Asia, it's a mixed bag. Japan, I think, does a good job with governance. I think it's done a good job on the environmental side. Social issues in Japan have a long way to go. So lots of nuance. The great thing is what we're seeing with ESG in a lot of ways is that the financial community is stepping in where the governments have lagged and is advancing the cause by having, like Larry Fink at BlackRock, come out with the type of statements he has, what you're seeing with the Dutch pensions, German investors. I think these are groups that are pushing the world forward. And I also think that you've got US consumers are doing a lot. One of the things I like to joke about is I actually believe that Walmart may have done more to advance environmental causes over the last 15 years than the government of France has. And they did it because they realized they can make more money. They're saving money on energy by having things like skylights in their stores and LEDs and working on reducing packaging. And Walmart has been able to push this upstream quite a bit. but they're doing it solely because they know they will make more money. And they also want people like us to shop there, so they're starting to market some products that are, have a bigger appeal. And that, it's just interesting to see this, government's got to move, corporations have to move, but finance is going to drive so much of this.
Thank you.
Brad, I wanted to ask about pushback against ESG. And the reason for my question is that I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago and mentioned it and practically had my head handed to me. It was in Columbia, South Carolina. I was talking to the Lieutenant Governor about economic development and mentioned that ESG is a criteria and companies are using this. And just the mention of ESG, like you said, she practically took my head off. And I'm curious, I didn't understand why that occurred. Do you have any insight?
Yeah, and it's so frustrating, John. So when I decided to start Credo, I called one of my Moorhead classmates, who's the CEO of a private equity fund in New York, and this is a guy that I've been very close to for a long time. And I'll edit out the expletives, but yeah, he told me what a stupid idea it was, and that I was too much of a do-gooder, and that people like, and this is a guy that had sent his, he's white, he had sent his daughter to the African Leadership Academy for an exchange year in high school. He's been very progressive on social causes. Personally, I think does a lot environmentally, but he ripped into me about how stupid I was to be going into ESG, and at the time we were going to focus on private equity, and we thought that private equity firms really needed the ESG help, and that our calling, our sort of nose under the tent for private equity would be, we will come in and help you increase the environmental performance of your companies, which will save money for you. So you'll have more cash flow, and because you're doing this and do other good ESG things, when you exit the company, you should get a higher multiple on your cash flow. So it's we're pulling two levers for private equity, and he was just like, this is an absolute waste of time. How can I possibly ask company management to do this? We're already asking them to, go buy a bunch of other companies and increase the debt. We can't do this. And I spent the first 6 to 8 months with Credo smashing into this wall with private equity. So these are, your compatriots from Harvard Business School, other leading people in the world do not give a damn about this and think it is going to be a drag. And this is why we started talking about building better companies and trying to get people to understand that that's really what ESG is going to do. And the audience we're finding that's receptive is venture capital. They get it, because they're thinking more long term. Private equity audience, they are going to do the minimum, and they see it as this is just another compliance thing. I think that the Fox News types have latched onto this as, especially with the SEC and the requirement around emissions, that they're trying to make it political, woke capitalism. I hear constantly, but I go back, and we've written a newsletter on this, that this is the SEC doing its job. These are material risks. If your company is not paying attention to the changes in the environment, it is going to bite you financially at some point. Like I've been calling out the Florida real estate market. I don't get it. I don't understand how you could be building a 1,000-foot tall tower in Miami, where you're going to have if a Cat 6 hurricane is going to hit any major U.S. city, it's going to be Miami, and it just makes no sense. Plus the daytime flooding they're already having, and the insurance markets have been, they've been recognizing this risk and pulling back, but the financial markets, the debt markets, haven't quite gotten there yet, and realized that when you look at underwriting a loan, insurance is such a major part of that, but we're underwriting basically to the cost of the policy at the time the loan is underwritten, not the potential cost of that policy 3, 4, 5, 6 years down the road. And I'll give you one of the worst pieces of pushback just happened sometime in the last, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. The head of responsible investing at HSBC was giving a talk and decided to be provocative and said that you don't need to worry about environmental risk because our portfolio has a weighted average life of 6 years. And within 6 years, this risk is not going to hit your investments. And the guy was placed on leave by the end of the day, but had pre-cleared the title of his speech before giving it. But this is the attitude that still is in finance. And I find it unconscionable. I think we're headed towards a like 2008 type of reckoning for the structured finance markets. We're gonna see something like that in the insurance markets here fairly quickly. That if we have a major hurricane or two hitting Florida, insurers are just going to pull out of that market entirely, and then all the holders of the debt that exists down there are going to be like, what the hell? We don't have the protection we thought we had. And then they're going to look to government to come in and bail them out again. So anyway, lots to talk about.
Yeah, I know in the interest of time, maybe we'll make this our last question.
Just one quick one. The Goldman story you said about SEC looking into them, does the SEC really have metrics that we can rely upon to say, no, you were wrong, your prospectus is wrong? Do we have any solid metrics on ESG for people like SEC to make summary judgments like that?
I haven't read enough about the case yet, Vic, or I haven't seen enough in the press that would lead me to be able to give you an intelligent answer to that question. But I think if they've gone and initiated action, I would think that they've got pretty good evidence that it violated the criteria. So you'd have to know. I'd have to go read the disclosure document, the prospectus for the mutual fund, to see what it said they were going to do versus what actually got put.
No, but in principle, does the community have an established belief that ESG metrics are this, that, and that?
Well, I think in this case, Goldman put in a document what they thought ESG metrics were,
okay.
and then they haven't matched the metrics. So that's a great thing about securities disclosure, that you got to put the document out there, and you'll get these, used to be by mail, but by email, and if you read it, it's supposed to be true. And if it's not true, somebody is going to get sued.
Okay, this will be last question. Okay, go ahead.
I was just asking, what do you think of companies, aside from Walmart and Scatter Few, are going to see that there's strategic imperative, if not an opportunity, rather than a risk or a fear of regulation?
You'd be surprised at how much we're seeing currently. One of the best companies I've seen as a privately held North Carolina textile company is incredibly forward-thinking on all of ESG and doing a great job. And they're looking at a big part of it for them is securing their cost of energy going forward. That they want to have more on-the-ground solar and to be able to control their destiny. But at the same time, they realize that, especially being in the textile industry, that being ESG savvy makes them sexy for kids coming out at State and Carolina and Duke to go work there. That woke capitalism appeals to this current generation. So if you are in I'll give you a public textile company in North Carolina, Unify. Unify makes a fiber reprieve that's made out of recycled PET, so Coke bottles, and they are casting themselves as a really cool company. And Nike, 50% of the product content that Nike has is reprieve. So this stuff is coming from recycled Coke bottles, and they're starting to tell that story. They're realizing it's an important thing to do, and they want to have the employees of the future attract the best and the brightest and Harvard grads. So I think it's happening despite the pushback you hear in the press. Good management knows the stuff is important and really wants to embrace it.
Thank you so much. And speaking of Harvard, we have a gift from the Harvard Club, from the Harvard Coop for you for spending time with us. We hope that you enjoy. Do you want to open it? You could, it's Harvard. Harvard
I've actually spent a lot of time at my old job at UNC or in the bookstore, so I spent a lot of time at the Coop, and I'm sure Jerry, I think it's like Jerry Fitzgerald is the head of the Coop. Great guy. It's a fantastic place.
Yeah.
Ah.
They're engraved glasses with the Harvard logo.
Ah, very nice. Very nice.
I'd like to
thank you all for being here. We really, it's good to see everyone back in person, so thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. That's great. Oh my gosh.
Hey Brad, I can run that.
I feel like we met.
I was going to say, yeah.
But are they